Hey, how's it going? We're going to do the next lesson now, lesson 3, which is Introduction to the Nervous System. So the nervous system in general regulates function of the body. It can be broken up into two major parts. So here on the left side, you see in red the brain and this long tail that comes down, which is the spinal cord. So this is what we refer to as the central nervous system. In contrast to the image on the right side, you can still see the brain here, but now we're focusing on these yellow, stringy projections. Now these are nerves, peripheral nerves, and this is what we refer to as the peripheral nervous system. So two different parts, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. And we're going to talk about their structure and their function and some really important points about each one. So the central nervous system, the CNS, normally what we call it, it's just a lot to say. We're just going to call it CNS, is composed of two major portions, the brain and the spinal cord, as we just saw on the previous image. Whereas the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, is composed of the somatic and the autonomic systems. There's also an enteric system. We're not going to talk about that in this video, but if you would like to talk about it a little bit more, in fact, we might mention it a few times throughout, but for now, we're just going to stick with these two. So we have somatic. Somatic means under your own volition. Okay, voluntary control. So somatic, we think of, I have a granola bar sitting on my bench. I'm extremely hungry. It's been a long couple of days, and I'm going to pick up this granola bar and I'm going to devour this granola bar. So I am going to have voluntary control of the movement in my arm so that I can pick up this granola bar and I can eat it. In contrast to the somatic nervous system, which is under voluntary control, we have the autonomic nervous system. Sometimes you'll see visceral, okay? The autonomic system is a system that is not under voluntary control. These are things that happen automatically, okay? So autonomic, think of automatic. These are things that you don't have to think about, thankfully, such as breathing, okay, or controlling heart rate. These are things that your body does all the time. It does them in the background. We don't have to think about it. They just sort of get done, okay? And so here again we see brain, spinal cord, and we have all these different nerves coming off, okay? So there's going to be definitely a central component and there's going to be a peripheral component. And what we're going to see is that function is regulated, okay, by sort of a signaling highway, which is the spinal cord that actually connects the brain to things that are happening outside of it, i.e. everywhere else in the body, okay, which is the peripheral system. So we have to have a way of receiving sensory stimulation from the environment and then cross-checking it, sending it to the brain so that the brain can then make a determination about what our response is going to be, and then sending that information back to the periphery again. Okay, so some examples of this might be you touch something sharp, okay, and then you decide you're going to pull your hand away because you realize that it's going to hurt your finger. Okay, another example of this might be you touch a hot burner and you instantaneously pull your hand away. Now those are actually two different types of responses. One is a very much a thought-induced intentional response where you've looked at the sharp object, realized that it was sharp, decided that you do not want to hold that anymore, versus the other response, which is what we call an autonomic reflex. Okay, that's a reflex. So you put your hand on something hot, you start to sense the pain, and you will automatically remove your hand off without having to think about it. Okay, that's a reflex. Now these are two different types of actions, okay, but they basically speak the same point, that we have to have a way of taking in information and responding to that information. That's really what these systems do. Okay, so central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Okay, we're then going to break this into two different types of pathways. We have sensory pathways and we have motor pathways. A lot of times we just sort of refer to this collection as sensory motor signaling, because really they do work hand in hand. But when we think of the motor pathways, then we can divide these into autonomic versus somatic. Okay, so one of the things that we will be doing is investigating some of these things in detail. So we'll save some of this, okay? But even when we get to the autonomic nervous system, okay, we're going to be doing different things such as parasympathetic and sympathetic system here. Okay, so this is going to be, it's complicated. There's a lot of things going on. We're not going to cover all of it, but we're going to kind of go through and talk about the major points of the nervous system. So there's a couple of really important cell types in the nervous system that we have to be aware of, okay? The first cell type is obviously the neuron. We've talked a little bit about the neuron. You probably know something about the neuron. The neuron, what is it? It is the basic unit of the nervous system, the core of the nervous system to some degree. These cells are nerve cells. They are excitable, which means that they can be activated. And when they are activated, they will actually transmit electrical signals, okay? And ultimately chemical signals to be able to communicate with other cells with which they are connected, okay? So this is what forms the neural networks, is this ability of one neuron to become excited, to transmit an electrical signal, release chemicals that will then bind to the next neuron so that that one can become activated and send the signal down and so on. I mean, really, how else are we going to get signals from the brain all the way down to the bottom of your foot? Well, this is how we do it. The other major cell type is called glia. Now, glia, super interesting, super cool cells. Quite literally, okay, nerve glue. And they are named as such because glia are actually everywhere throughout the brain, particularly. They vastly outnumber the neurons. A lot of people don't know that. We hear a lot about the neuron, but the glia are actually very important. They're supportive cells, okay? So they provide a lot of nutrients. They buffer the environment to make sure that it's safe within the brain for all the different cells in terms of regulating ion balances and things like that. And they are very dynamic. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time investigating is the ways in which glial cells respond to injury. And that was one of my major focuses in the research that I was conducting on stroke and neurodegenerative diseases. And there's a lot of things about glia that a lot of people don't know. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about those in a few lessons from now when we actually start diving into the specifics of the different cell types. But for now, this is sort of just the general overview. So here you see an image of the neuron, okay? Again, we said it's the basic functional unit, okay, that uses different types of signals and it forms synapses, okay? With not only with other neurons, but also with different tissues throughout the body. So here you can see some of the major features of the neuron. This here is our cell body, okay, sometimes called the soma. And we have our nucleus in the middle. Just like any other cell, the neuron needs to be able to, transcribe its DNA, make mRNA messages, translate proteins, have different types of post-translational modifications, so different things get tacked onto proteins, different types of functional groups, and there's a lot of chemistry involved there, but basically making different types of proteins that can do different types of things, like receptors, enzymes, etc. Okay, and you got to have your endoplasmic reticulum going on, you've got to have your ribosomes, your mitochondria to power the cell to produce all of that ATP. So all those things happen in here, okay, in this nucleus. And then we have the dendrites. Now these are the parts of the cell that are actually going to form synapses. So these dendrites are going to synapse on in a region where we have the axon terminals of other cells, okay? So linking, kind of like a baton race, is sort of the way that I like to think of it sometimes. And I'm going to draw this out later as well, okay? But so we have these features here. We have what we call the myelin sheath, okay? So not all neurons, but many types of neurons are myelinated. And what the myelin does is it really acts as an insulation. So you can think of a wire, okay? Back to our nerves as wires sort of analogy here. You can think of an electrical wire as to conduct an electrical current. And that electrical current is preserved and it is most effective when we have insulation on the wire, right? So we don't want the electrons to escape out, so the wire is insulated. Well, in much the same way, the neurons in our body, many of which are insulated with myelin. So myelin's an insulator that kind of will keep the current in there so that this current can travel very quickly down the axon. Now this is particularly important in situations where we have to travel long distances, right? Because we want to make sure that the signal is very fast and very efficient, okay? Now in between these myelin portions here are little spaces that is not labeled on this diagram, but they're called nodes of Ranvier. And these are actually the places where we have exchange of ions across the membrane to help facilitate the conduction of that current down the axon, okay? And then here, of course, is where we are going to have ultimately the release of neurotransmitters, okay, out of these cells, which are going to then bind to the neighboring neuron, okay, through a synapse here and cause that cell to fire or to not fire, as it turns out, okay, because we can either inhibit the function of neighboring neurons or we can actually excite them. And it just depends. It depends on what we're trying to do, okay? So here's a few examples of different ways that neurons can synapse. So here we have what we call a neuronal synapse. This is one neuron, okay, forming a synapse with another neuron. So you can see the axon terminals of the first neuron, okay, or the presynaptic neuron. We call this the presynaptic neuron because it comes before the synapse, okay? Now the synapse is the portion here where these two cells connect. And that's where the so-called magic happens, right? That's where the neurotransmitters get released from one neuron and they bind to the other one. Okay, so this neuron on the left is the presynaptic neuron. Here we have the postsynaptic neuron. Post meaning after, right? So it's the second one after the synapse, okay? And that's the one that's going to be receiving the signals from the presynaptic neuron, okay? But the point here really is that these are two neurons forming a synapse, okay? Whereas we can have other types of synapses in the body. Now we talked about one of them in the history lesson, okay, where we were saying the experiments with the nerve twitch, right, stimulating the nerve fibers that are actually part of the system that controls muscular contraction. So here we have a muscle neuron, okay, a motor neuron is what we call it because it's going to help us move. It's going to stimulate skeletal muscle, which is actually going to help us move, right? So your skeletal muscles are the muscles that are attached to all your bones and they help us with movement. So here, this muscle is going to synapse onto some skeletal tissue. And when this cell fires, an electrical current will move down the axon to the skeletal muscle, and this will actually stimulate a current on the skeletal muscle, which in turn causes calcium release and some other things that causes the muscle to actually contract. In a similar fashion, we have a neuroglandular synapse, okay? Now, a gland is a particular type of tissue, it's made of glandular cells, that is responsible for releasing things, okay? For example, you have sweat glands, okay? Now, your sweat glands are made up of specific cells that manufacture, yes, wait for it, sweat, right? So, when these glandular neurons, okay, forms a neuroglandular synapse. When this neuron excites this tissue, we're going to have the release of whatever that gland releases, okay? And in our example, sweat, okay? So just a few different ways that neurons can behave and how they can synapse. Now glia, okay, in the central nervous system are a little different from glia in the peripheral nervous system. So now we're going to make a little distinction between these, okay? We're going to talk in general about the major types of glia. And then we're going to save the rest of this conversation for later when we actually go through this in more detail, okay? But the central nervous system, okay, has four major types of glia. It has astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and ependymal cells, okay? And here, on the right side, we can take a look and we can see these four different types. Now you're going to notice straight away, the first thing is that they have very different, what we call morphology, okay? And morphology morph, meaning to change shape, right? If somebody morphs, that means they're shifting their shape around. So morphology means the shape, the appearance of a cell. Okay, so when we do histology and when we look at cells and the way that cells react to certain different types of stimulation, oftentimes they change their shape. So here we can see that an astrocyte, this is really a star-shaped sort of cell. Okay, so it has this part in the middle, and then it has these fibers that come off of it, and it very much resembles a star. And I'm going to show you some actual images from stained astrocytes, and we're going to do some of this. The oligodendrocyte looks somewhat similar to the astrocyte, even though in this picture you can't really see that, okay? With the oligodendrocytes, while the astrocytes interact in many different ways in the brain, the major function of the oligodendrocyte really is to ensheath neurons with myelin. Okay, so oligodendrocytes are the myelin-making cells, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I don't want to get too much into the function. Right now, we're kind of just trying to give a quick overview of the different types of cells. Then we have our microglia, okay? Also look a little bit different. They're different in size too, so that's something we'll talk about. And ependymal cells, okay, which also have a very unique function relative to the other three, okay? Now in the peripheral nervous system, the glia that we're interested in and the types that we deal with are called satellite cells and Schwann cells, okay? So the satellite cells, okay, are the supportive cells. They're somewhat analogous to the astrocytes that you would find in the central nervous system, although they're not quite as exciting and interesting, at least we don't think. Whereas the Schwann cells are sort of analogous to the oligodendrocytes that we find in the central nervous system, because they also myelinate neurons, okay? Only they myelinate neurons in the peripheral nervous system only, whereas the oligodendrocytes myelinate neurons in the central nervous system only, okay? So there's a big distinction between those two. And here you can actually see a Schwann cell interacting with a neuron. This is a peripheral motor neuron here, okay? And it's actually ensheathing the cell with myelin, all right? And then we have a satellite cell here, okay? So we've got a Schwann cells, we got a satellite cell providing some nourishment there alongside of it, all right? So how does this actually work out? Well, we have neuronal projections, which means that neurons will send projections, right? Meaning they're axons. So they're going to project from the cell body down to the terminal via the axon. Okay? Now they can project in either afferent or efferent ways. Okay? Now this is sort of a relative term. It can be kind of confusing, but afferent means that we're going towards the central location. Okay? So afferent is toward some location, whereas efferent means we're moving away from that location. Okay, and what we can use as an example, okay, if we have an afferent nerve projection, okay, to the CNS, that means that it's actually traveling towards the central nervous system, whereas an efferent projection would be traveling away from this nervous system. With this example, we can see here that a sensory input, so let's say your eye, for example, you're taking in photons, light, okay, now those receptors in your eye are going to process this light, and you have neurons, okay? You have a nerve that actually travels to your brain, okay? It's your optic nerve. Now, this signal is going to be an afferent projection, okay? An afferent signal that's going to go from your periphery, which is your eye, right? Now, your eye obviously is not part of your brain, really, although it does send a nerve to your brain. So it's going to go afferent to your central nervous system, and then it's going to activate signals that then come efferent, okay, back out to the peripheral nervous system, away from the central nervous system, okay? And in this case, since we have this leg here, and it's telling us that maybe we want to run, perhaps you've seen a giant bear, okay? This would be one reason why this sensory stimulation might trigger a motor response, okay? I see bear, I'm processing bear, I'm telling my body, get the heck out of here, right? So the role of the spinal cord in this whole system is critical, it's crucial, okay? The spinal cord is the highway okay, for everything that goes from the periphery to the brain and back. All right, and we use spinal nerves to do this. Okay, so these nerves are actually the key communicators, okay, between the peripheral portion of your body and your brain. All right, and what happens is these nerves, okay, are going to attach to your spinal cord through what we call roots. All right, so they're basically big areas where lots of fibers actually come in and connect to the nervous system. And I'm going to show you some pictures of this in a minute, okay? So you're going to have dorsal roots and ventral roots, okay? Now, the difference between these, and when we do neuroanatomy next and we talk about the directions, this dorsal and ventral is going to make more sense. Right now, they just seem like random words that I just made up, okay? But they're actually not. They refer to a particular part or a side of the body, okay? But for now, the dorsal roots, okay, are going to contain axons from neurons, okay, that have brought information into the spinal cord. So all the information that comes into the spinal cord, okay, is going to come in through a dorsal root, okay? And all the information carried on axons away from the spinal cord is going to leave through ventral roots. Okay, so we have dorsal roots and we have ventral roots. Now here, okay, this is an image actually of a rat brain. It's very, in many ways, it's very similar to a human brain. We'll talk more about that, okay? But the top part of it here, this surface is what we call the dorsal surface, okay? And this bottom part down here is what we call the ventral surface. Now these are anatomical directions that we're going to learn shortly, okay? But this is the reason why we have the dorsal root, okay, so these are the ones on the top, and we have the ventral roots, which are the ones on the bottom, okay? So dorsal just refers to the fact that they actually come and impinge on the spinal cord on the top surface, the dorsal surface, whereas these come in through the ventral surface, okay? All right? There's also some other key structures that we want to talk about. And really, the meninges and the ventricular system, we can kind of talk about them together. But meninges, okay, are really, really important layers, okay, membranes, tissues that actually separate the skull, okay, well, actually, they sort of provide some support, okay, for the skull or the vertebral column, okay, and the brain, or the spinal cord. So essentially, your skull, right? Your brain sits underneath your skull, okay? And your spinal cord sits underneath your vertebral column. So these membranes are sort of in between there. And what they do is some really important things, okay? So you've got three major layers. Now the meninges, okay, refer to the collection of all three, okay? So when you hear meninges, we're talking about the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater, okay? All three of these constitute the meninges, all right? Now, the dura mater is the first layer of protection, okay, immediately underneath, and that is a very tough layer, okay, very leathery layer. So if we're talking about the brain, that's going to be the first layer that's right underneath the skull, okay? So if we were to drill a hole right through the top of the skull, you're going to hit the first thing you're going to hit when you get to the other side is the dura mater, okay? We then have an arachnoid membrane, okay, underneath the dura, and then we have the pia mater, or the pia mater, underneath that, okay? And that is the thinnest membrane, and that's actually attached to the brain surface, okay? The subarachnoid space is a region that's actually filled with what we call cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Now, this is actually important because if you think about it, you have a brain underneath your skull, okay? And what you want to have is a situation where you have a few different membranes to protect it, but you also want some sort of shock absorbing, okay? Because if you were to fall or get punched in the head, or get kicked in the head, or get in some kind of an accident where your body is jarred very quickly, right? What you don't want happening is your brain bouncing into your skull, okay? Because that would cause bruising on your brain and you can have some injured brain tissue, okay? So this subarachnoid space is really important because it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, which in addition to providing nutrition for the brain, it also acts as a shock absorber. Okay, so your brain essentially is sitting inside of a fluid-filled sac in a way, right? And so that's going to help you out a lot, like if you get some kind of injury or something like that. Okay, the ventricular system of the brain, okay, like we saw in the last lesson, these hollow sort of regions, your ventricles actually allow the cerebrospinal fluid to flow throughout all the different parts of your brain. Okay, so your brain can be bathed in CSF. And the CSF is produced by a very special tissue in your brain that's called your choroid plexus. Okay, so here we talked about a few different things. We have this brain. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute. Okay, but we have the meninges. Okay, so it's right underneath the bone. Whether we're talking about the skull bone, okay, the meninges separate the skull bone from the brain. They also separate the vertebral column, right, or the vertebrae, the bones in your spine, okay? They separate those from your spinal cord, okay? So they're present in both places. Meninges made of 3 different parts, the dura, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater, okay? There is a subarachnoid space in here that's filled with CSF, and we're going to see that in a second. And the CSF is important because it flows throughout the ventricles of the brain, the ventricular system. It provides nourishment to the brain, and it provides, and it's produced, rather, by the choroid plexus of the brain, okay? So here you can see a pretty good image. So let's kind of go through this, okay? Protection of the brain and spinal cord. Here, this is a picture of the brain, so we're going to look at this one first. And we can see that we have here this rough layer. This is the dura on the top. And then we have the arachnoid membrane in here, and this subarachnoid space within, okay? Now this is actually where that CSF is filled, okay? So this is where we were talking about. We have this space filled with CSF that's going to cause some shock absorbing, okay? Then you have your pia mater here on the bottom, and this is actual brain tissue, all right? So what you can see here is that there's a vessel, okay? There's blood vessels running right on top of the pia mater. See, this is the pia mater here, okay, the thinnest one that covers directly over the brain, and we have vessels, okay? Now these major vessels branch off into minor vessels, okay, that are actually going to irrigate, okay, all the different regions of your brain to provide blood to all the cells in the brain, okay? So this is a very cool and complicated system that this uses, okay, to be able to provide your brain with nourishment and also provide some protection, right? Okay. And then here you can see a view of the brain. Okay, again, this is the subarachnoid space around. Here is your choroid plexus. Okay, now these are ventricles in the brain. And ultimately, they all connect at some point. And depending on which section through the brain we're looking at, you won't always be able to see the ventricles. And you won't always be able to see all of the ventricles. Okay, so we have the lateral ventricles, which are here. Okay, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, okay? But we're going to talk more about that later, so we don't have to worry about those too much for now. But for now, we just want to understand that we do have these ventricles that actually do carry CSF throughout the entire brain, okay? And it does get distributed throughout it, okay? Now here's an image just to give you some idea of how this also happens in the spinal cord, okay? So here we have the brain. This is the spinal cord, and it's covered, protected by the vertebral column. Okay, so this is the vertebral column here. If we were to take a very close-up view of one of these sections, this is what we would see here. Okay, so this is your actual spinal cord, right? This is your spinal cord here, this region. These are nerves, okay? So here we have a ventral root. These are the ventral roots coming in the ventral portion of the spinal cord, okay? So remember, the ventral portion would be this part here, okay? So this is dorsal on this side, and this would be ventral on this side here, okay? So the ventral root and the dorsal root coming in, and then here we have our pia mater, okay? We have our dura mater here, right? And then we have the arachnoid here. So we have the same exact setup in the spinal cord as we have in the brain, okay? All right. So you're probably asking yourself, at this point, this is completely awesome. And what if I want to hear more? I'm not done yet. I want to hear more about the nervous system, and this is what you should do. And you should probably know by now automatically that this is going to be a link to my buddy Hank, because he actually has a crash course video about this. You don't have to watch this if you don't want to, but if you're interested and you want to watch it, it's a pretty good one. Okay. Here is your quiz. This is going to test you to see whether or not you've gotten some of the important points. Again, as always, and I'll probably say this every single video, but you should always, always, always be taking notes, okay? So I hope you enjoyed it, and we will kick off next time with neuroanatomy.